It's the same hustle, it's the same pain, the same tears on everything. Maybe one day we'll see we're one big family, like it's one kettle. It's the same sunshine, it's the same rain, the same struggle just to maintain. Maybe one day we'll see we're one big family, like it's one kettle.
Greetings and welcome to Discussions with Indigenous Education, the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian. I'm your host, Tavis Sanders, also known as Red Tail Hawk. I'd like to welcome our co-host, Renee Sanders, also known as Red Silver Fox.
Greetings, everyone.
Yeah, so this is episode 3 of the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian, and we've gotten into a lot already. You know, we're going to review last week's show before we get into this show, right? In last week's show, we talked about Article 1 and Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, and we also talked about the various groups that are protected. Mm-hmm. And so let's get into that a little bit before we get into today's show, which is going to concentrate on the various stages of genocide.
Okay.
Yeah, right. And so let's read Article 1 just to refresh the memory of our viewing audience.
Okay. Well, Article 1 says genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law which they undertake to prevent and to punish.
Which is very important, particularly in today's conversation.
Ooh.
I think they're really going to like our conversation. But we need individuals to keep that in mind. Again, in times of war or peace, right? And is undertaken to prevent and to punish. Those are the 4 words. If you got a pen and paper, write those 4 words down, and let's watch how these things relate to the dark-skinned Indian with respect to our history. All right, let's read Article 2 real quick, and we won't get into that as much because I know, we got a lot to do today.
Okay, well, real quick, I don't know because it's a long, it's a long article, okay. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Or E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
And, it might be triggering for some individuals, right? And, we deal with this a lot. And so we are able to maintain our emotions as we go through these things, but we like to acknowledge that, for us, and particularly with respects to this conversation, it's important to us, and it really does matter, right? Yes. Which is why we wanted to offer this. So we need you to keep all of those things in mind also. Maybe if you have the internet, you can just grab Article 2, right, and use that as a reference as we go through this too, because again, we're going to be describing moments in histories, events, ways in which the system perpetuated these crimes on a dark-skinned Indian. And to be frank and honest with you, the crimes have been so precise, right? They've accomplished their goals so much so that it's difficult for me.
Well, and that is actually, and we're going to be going over the stages, but that is actually the last stage, which is denial.
Wow, okay, interesting. Okay, well, you know what? Moving on to the stages, which is going to be the conversation that we center on today.
Well, you didn't want to go over these the protected groups first? Okay. And the descriptions of the groups so that we know what they mean by the groups, right. National, ethnical. Now, we did go over that last week, but I think, again, refreshing the memory, I think wouldn't be a bad idea.
All right, go ahead. So we're going to be going over the names of the protected groups.
Yes, the protected groups.
Okay.
Okay, so a national group means a set of individuals whose identity is defined by a common country of nationality or national origin. Okay, an ethnical group is a set of individuals whose identity is defined by common cultural traditions, language, or heritage, separate from racial, which is the next group is racial group.
Okay.
And that means a set of individuals whose identity is defined by physical characteristics and physical characteristics only. Okay? And then religious group is a set of individuals whose identity is defined by common religious creeds, beliefs, doctrines, practices, or rituals.
All right, yeah. And so to wrap up last show, right, the individuals have to fit into one of the protected groups, right? And I think that we articulated very well how the dark-skinned indigenous population here of the United States, right, southeastern portions of the United States particularly, and how just dark-skinned people in general in this country, you know, can fit into, you know, at least one of these protected groups, right? And we all can imagine just from the history that we do know about a lot of the atrocities that happened to this particular demographic of the United States, right? So we need you to keep all of these things in mind as we go into the stages now.
Yeah,
right?
and I was going to say also, though, you know, realizing that people are in more than one of these groups most of the
Right,
time. You know,
right.
some of them are even born into these groups.
And some of them were born into one group but are forced into another group, right? And so those are the kinds of things that we're here to talk about today, right? And so in today's show, we're going to be going over the 10 stages of genocide. There are 10 stages that have been outlined, and we want to go through those 10 stages and then, you know, get into the specifics with respects to each stage and its relationship to the, you know, darker skinned Indian. But before we go into the stages, I wanted to talk about where it came from and how it came about, because, you know, it matters with respects to whether we even want to acknowledge and utilize this document, right?
Yes, yes. Well, it was a document that was written, the 10 Stages of Genocide, a document written by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Gregory H. Stanton. All right, it was written in 1996. Okay. All right, and while he was at the Department of State, or it was written for the Department of State, or you know, so it was written for the Department of State.
Oh, so this is a United States document.
Oh, this is the United States document, yes.
Okay.
Okay. Now, this gentleman, he was a professor at many different colleges, you know, so they had Mary Washington University, George Mason University, a whole lot of other universities that he was, that he taught at. And he was the vice president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. All right. Yes. And he started also the Genocide Watch, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the fight against genocide.
Now, so he definitely has the experience,
Oh, yes.
right? And the skill with respects to education to be able to really consider putting something together like this that would, you know, matter, right?
Yes, but not only that though, he worked as a voting rights advocate.
Okay.
All right. In Mississippi, as a matter of fact.
During the 50s?
I'm not sure exactly what time that was. No, that would be much later than that.
Okay.
Okay, because remember, the genocide, it was written in 1996.
All right.
Okay.
Right.
Yes, all right. So yeah, bring yourself up to present. Okay.
Okay. But he worked for voters' rights in Mississippi.
In Mississippi,
we still need people to do that.
Oh,
today,
yes, most
right,
definitely.
Right. So,
He also worked as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ghana. Okay. You know,
right.
and you know what is something that is also very interesting is that his mother was an advocate in the women's suffrage movement.
Okay.
So he was kind of born into this advocacy.
Right. All right. So yeah. So he definitely has, you know, the experience, the knowledge, and you know the life skills necessary as something that's been being this generation now, the advocacy for peoples in general, right? Particularly in Mississippi, you advocate for black people, right? To go vote.
Right.
So somebody that's definitely worth sharing as far as the history that this individual has, created and made as a part of the American story, right?
Yeah, now seeing that really those are things that we should always look into when we are doing research, is to see what the background information is on the person that you may be reading or the information that they are giving. You need to know where that information is coming from and whether it is someone that you can depend on for accuracy of information.
And, interesting enough, as I piggyback off of that point, going back into Article 1, intent matters so much, right? And what is the intention for you to develop this? And when you look at the individual, his history, his past, his family, you can learn more about the individual, and you can, give credence to whether you can trust this information.
Yes.
Offset, definitely always verifying what anyone has told you with
Yes.
respect to any of this kind of stuff, right?
And again, any research that you're doing, so any book that you're reading, you need to know what the author of, what the intent of that author is.
Mm-hmm. Right, so you can easily decipher, or at least have a better chance to decipher the subjective information from the objective, or the factual information
From the propaganda.
from the propaganda. Okay, with that, it's time for us to take a break. But before we go into break, let's list the stages of genocide.
Okay, the 10 stages of genocide are classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and denial, the one that we just mentioned.
Okay, and so those are the 10 stages of genocide. And when we get back from the break, we'll start getting into the specifics of the stages, and maybe we'll get into one of them very well. So we'll be back with more discussions with Indigenous education, the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian.
An American Deceptions Revealing America's Dark-Skinned Past, Volume 1, is a trailblazing depiction of the lesser-known history of America's dark-skinned indigenous peoples, now referred to as African American and Afro-Latinos. Red Silver Fox Thunderbird mends together indigenous oral history, primary sources, archaeology, and extensive research to paint a vivid picture of the original groups that resided in the Americas in the shadows of the continent's past, which include both Mongoloid and Negroid groups. Revealing America's Dark-Skinned Past exposes the true history of Indigenous Americans in contrast to what we have been told in school and what has been presented in entertainment. This miseducation and reclassification of the original peoples span over hundreds of years, but Thunderbird impressively lays out how identity transformation occurred. This book reveals hidden knowledge that shatters the accepted concept of the transatlantic slave trade and makes one question the African identity given to Black Americans and Afro-Latinos. Revealing America's Dark-Skinned Past, Volume 1, is a noteworthy book that confronts an element of American Indian and Black history that many have not grasped.
You're watching Discussions with Indigenous Education.
Greetings and welcome back to Discussions with Indigenous Education, the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian. Before the break, we went over the 10 stages of genocide, where we listed the 10 stages of genocide. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to list them again, and then we're going to get into the first stage and see what we get from today's conversation, right?
Okay.
And so the 10 stages are, again, classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, prosecution,
Persecution.
Persecution, excuse me, I don't have my glasses on, extermination, and denial, right? And so those are the 10 stages. And of course, each stage has its own definition. Right?
Oh, of course.
And so, again, if you're following us, you can search it online, the 10 Stages of Genocide, and you'll be able to read along with us. Of course, we're going to throw the definition up right now for the first stage, which is classification. So why don't you read classification, and then we'll get into it a little bit.
Okay. Well, classification. Groups in a position of power will categorize people according to ethnicity, race, religion, or nationality. Those groups. Those four protected groups. Okay. Employing an us versus them mentality. Okay. All right.
That's important.
Yes.
Okay.
So one of the most important classifications in the current nation-state system is citizenship in a nationality. Okay. Removal or denial of a group's citizenship is a legal way to deny the group's civil and human rights.
Interesting. A lot of important terms for us to remember in this one.
Okay.
Okay.
And they even went so far to say Native Americans were not granted citizenship in the USA until 1924, after centuries of genocide that decimated their populations. And again, those were their words, not ours.
So interesting enough, before we move forward, let's talk about that for a minute. And again, we really want to reiterate that last sentence: the Native Americans were not granted citizenship in the United States until 1924, after centuries of genocide that disseminated their population. Those are their words, right? That's an exact quote. And so we just wanted to acknowledge that they participated in genocidal practices against the indigenous populations of the United States, right? Our issue with respects to organizing these shows and sharing our history is that as a part of these genocidal practices,
that they even went further.
They went further in erasing our history as a darker skinned indigenous population here in the United States. And we're going to outline and showcase how that's happened and why and how these things actually relate to genocidal practices that is still occurring against us to this day, right? And it matters a lot, right? So we want to take a small break here because, again, we want to get into the particulars of this classification, right? And we want to go all the way back to the beginning, right? When the the systems were first being introduced to the mainland United States, the indigenous populations there, and we want to, talk about how they viewed us and how they talked about classifying us, right? And so we'll be right back after you watch this short that we created, and then we can discuss the classification more and give people a little bit more reference. And so please check this out.
Today's topic, the 16th century Great Debate. In 1550, the King of Spain, Charles V, ordered all military conquest, expeditions, and explorations to cease until a special group of scholars and royal officials could hear a debate about the morality of Indian slavery and the Spanish conquest, and to issue a ruling on the controversy. The two opposing views were presented by Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who believed that the Indians were free men in the natural order and deserved the same treatment as others according to Catholic theology, and Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, who believed that, quote, in order to uproot crimes that offend nature, end quote, that reducing the Indians to slavery was in accordance with Catholic theology and natural law. This debate lasted 5 days and was the first debate in the world about human rights. Sepúlveda's argument, which supported the interests of the colonists and landowners, was, and I quote his words, the most powerful and most perfect rule over the weakest and most imperfect, there being some who by nature are masters and others who by nature are slaves. Those who are dim-witted and mentally lazy, although they may be physically strong enough to fulfill all the necessary tasks, are by nature slaves. It is just and useful that it be this way. He felt that the Spaniards, quote, can destroy barbarism and educate these inferior people to a more humane and virtuous life. And if the latter reject such rule, it can be imposed upon them by force of arms. Such a war will be just according to natural law. End quote. Las Casas, whose position found some support from the monarchy, argued, and I quote his words, "The Indian race is not that barbaric, nor are they dull-witted or stupid, and very ready to accept honor and observe the Christian religion and correct their sins once priests introduce them to the sacred mysteries and the word of God." He said, quote, "Long before they had heard the word of the Spaniard, they had properly organized states, wisely ordered by excellent laws, religion, and custom. They lived in populous cities in which they wisely administered the affairs of both peace and war justly and equitably, truly governed by laws that at very many points surpass ours." In the end, both Sepulveda and Las Casas claimed victory. However, the group of scholars and royal officials never declared a winner in the debate. Sepulveda did not see any new laws created to defend his position, and Las Casas never saw an end to Indian slavery and the Spanish wars of conquest in the New World. You have just finished watching Indeed's Moments in Indigenous History. Please join us next time. Peace. You're watching Discussions with Indigenous Education on PhillyCam.
Okay, that was a very interesting a look at what was happening here in the United States. You know, interesting enough, as a part of this conversation, one of the first things that jumped out to me was that they stated that this was the first human rights discussion, international human rights discussion, right? And human rights is a big part of this whole conversation.
And what is also interesting is that they did not come up with a conclusion, And again, the same thing like what's happening on our border even today, like these things are difficult to iron out. And so just kick the can down the road really is.
Right. Well, we know what that kicking the can down the road led to is with respects to, one population. But I just wanted to, talk about a few other things because we're talking about classification, and how systems use classification to group individuals, right? And is an important aspect of the stage of genocide, being the first stage. First you group and then you separate and things of that nature. And I thought it was really interesting, the different perspectives of, what the indigenous and how to look at the indigenous population, where you have one group that said that these individuals are human beings, and at some point their systems supersede our systems of order, and then, you have another group that's just like, we classifying them as slaves, they're inferior, and they're worthy of subjugation. It's ridiculous, right?
Yeah, and it's ridiculous which one won out.
Okay, and so I wanted to relate this time, right? Again, we're talking about the mid-1500s, colonization is trying to happen here on mainland United States. They're getting a lot of pushback, particularly in the southeastern portions. Right?
Yes, because again, this debate took place in 1550. And 1550 on mainland United States, they still have not gotten a settlement yet. So they're really fighting against the indigenous people that are here on mainland United States, and that is because, in 1519 Mexico got conquered. Not too long after that, the Aztecs got conquered, and so you know, they have been trying to conquer mainland United States. It's 1550, and they still haven't done it.
And this is history between the indigenous population and Spain for the most part. And
Well,
so,
France too.
Yeah, well, you know, France.
Not Britain. Britain didn't come in yet.
Not Britain, and that's and that's why a lot of this history may be left out of our historical notes.
Yes.
Because it was a different country that was really doing the conquering during the 1500s and on the Americas.
Yes, and a lot of the information is in their archives written in Spanish.
Right. And so again, we're talking about the stage of genocide, right? And I would like to just showcase how what we just listened to, right, and this debate that they had relates back to Article 1. Right, because again, Article 2 of the genocide, right? It says, Genocide Convention, killing members, causing seriously bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. And in that debate, that's what you heard them state that they wanted to do to us. And again, although they never did come up with a resolution or a decision with respects to the first international human rights debate, which happens to be about a dark-skinned indigenous population on the mainland United States, interesting enough, we do know what the direction that history took. And I guess that's what, for the first stage of genocide, right? And grouping us and classifying us and classifying us as slaves, we are worthy of subjugation and we're worthy of these genocidal practices being conducted on our population.
Yeah, they classified us as savages. And so, again, it was just as easy to do this because we were not worthy, I guess.
Right. And classification of the population is something that offers space for things to occur to a group that may not necessarily be respectful of their human rights. Right. The governing systems says, okay, we classify this group as a slave population, and now that populace looks at that group as less than, or they look at themselves as inferior because of that classification. And that's why it's really important. And so we're actually going to take a break here.
Okay.
And when we get back, we'll get into more of the classification of the dark-skinned Indian, from the southeastern portions of the United States specifically, and show how these acts, fit the genocide of, fit that definition of genocide against us. And so we'll be right back with more discussions with Indigenous education, the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian.
Today's topic, Indians and slavery. Most people don't realize that the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade was when the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands were forcibly exported by Christopher Columbus to be used as slaves in Spain. Enslaving the indigenous people was legalized by the Pope, who declared the act to be in accord with the laws of God and man, and justified it on the ground that Indians could otherwise not be reclaimed from idolatry and converted to Christianity. Because of the Pope's approval, many royal decrees were written which allowed the enslaving of the indigenous people of the Americas. For example, in 1504, a royal decree stated that rebel Indians were to be enslaved, with a portion of the slaves to go to the government. Ponce de Leon's decree in 1512 provided that the Indians he found should be distributed as slaves to the members of his expedition. And in 1523, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon's decree allowed him to purchase prisoners of war from the Indians and to employ them on his farms or export them as he saw fit. Indian slavery in the Americas began with Columbus on the islands, continued on to the United States mainland, and continued throughout the colonization of the United States. By the way, most of the exploring expeditions, which captured and kidnapped slaves, were financed by men like Ponce de Leon and Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon, who became wealthy utilizing Indian slaves. You have just finished watching Indeed's Moments in Indigenous History. Please join us next time. Peace. Greetings. I'm Red Silver Fox, co-founder of Indeed Indigenous Education, and I would like to invite you to visit indedushop.com. That's indedushop.com, and help support our mission to educate the public of the omitted history of the brown and dark-skinned indigenous population of the Americas. And as always, we would like to thank you for your support.
In your family tree, then somebody out there can meet. Everybody saying the same hustle.